Hey YouTube, Alex here, and in today's video I want to cover the question why Chiang Mai. And the reason why I'm bringing this question up is I'm looking at moving to Thailand this fall, and I'm trying to decide, do I want to move to Bangkok or do I want to move to Chiang Mai? And so in this video I hope to tackle the question why I would choose Chiang Mai. So with Chiang Mai first off is going to be more laid back than Bangkok. It's going to have a slower pace. Sometimes if you've spent much time in Bangkok, you're aware of this, and if you haven't, it can feel overwhelming. It's a Los Angeles sized city as far as considering the metropolitan area. I think roughly like 18 to 20 million people, depending on who you ask. And so it definitely feels like a metropolis. And the difference there between Bangkok and Chiang Mai is Chiang Mai, if I'm not mistaken, the metro area is more like around 1 million people. So you don't have that hustle and bustle. You don't have the crowded subways. You don't have traffic to the same extent. Traffic can get quite bad in Chiang Mai, but not to the same as extreme as in Bangkok. And often the difference between sitting in traffic in Chiang Mai and sitting in traffic in Bangkok is in some cases you'll be within walking distance of where you want to go in Chiang Mai, whereas that can be less often the case in Bangkok. And alongside that, when you are dealing with different things in Chiang Mai, typically the lines aren't going to be as long as in Bangkok. Typically, the crowds aren't going to be as big as they are in Bangkok. Typically, you're not going to see these masses of people like you do in a massive city. So the next factor is going to be that several of the expats that I follow online, they are located in Chiang Mai. I have interacted with them a bit. One of them I had made plans to meet up, but our plans fell through due to the you-know-what. And then the other gentleman, I'm sure I could meet up if I did some organizing. But that's a really cool thing about Chiang Mai is that it does have some of the expats that I've been familiar with online that Bangkok doesn't have. Aside from that, also my buddy Will is in Chiang Mai, and so it would be nice to see some of these people, Matt, and catch up with them and be able to spend time with them. These people don't live in Bangkok, and while they do visit Bangkok, it's the majority of their time is spent in Chiang Mai, so that would be a really neat thing to do, to be able to have that kind of group of friends. The next factor here, and I'm always talking about the economics of this, how it could be done more efficiently as far as from a financial perspective, and Chiang Mai is cheaper than Bangkok. Bangkok is now actually the second most expensive city in Southeast Asia, right behind Singapore. So when you talk about costs, it's not really accurate to call Bangkok cheap anymore. It can be quite expensive, and definitely when I've spent time in Bangkok, I've opted for more modest accommodation at the same amount of money that I would get a nicer place in Chiang Mai. I don't necessarily have a problem with this because Bangkok, there's so much going on that I feel like I spend less time at the apartment anyway, but it's worth considering that if you're somebody that wants a nicer place on a budget, then Chiang Mai is going to definitely give you a larger place, a place in perhaps a more convenient neighborhood than for the same money in Bangkok. And with maybe nicer conveniences, maybe it comes with a washing machine, a nicer shower, things like that that you might not get for the same amount of money in Bangkok. I find that I get better value in terms of food for the same amount of money, not just street food, but also international food. You can get really good sushi in Chiang Mai for about $10, whereas I feel like to get something similar in Bangkok is going to cost more like $12, maybe $15. Not a major difference, but if you're talking about spending 8 months to a year over there, these kinds of costs can really add up from month to month. Also, I'd say I'd spend more on transportation in Bangkok because in Bangkok, I have the varieties of public transit and tuk-tuks and cabs and water taxis. And in Chiang Mai, it's renting a motorbike, which I'm not interested in doing, or taking a tuk-tuk or a songto, a red truck. So I find that it's easier, ironically, because of the smaller variety in Chiang Mai, for me to stick to a certain neighborhood and do all the things that I need to do in that neighborhood. Whereas in Bangkok, I always feel like I want to explore and go see this part of town or go see this thing or perhaps check this other thing out. And in Chiang Mai, it's a little bit more manageable. Once you've been to the zoo, you've been to Doi Suthep, you've been to a variety of temples, you've been to the Muay Thai stadium, you've been to the old city, you spent time on Niman, you've visited a lot of the coffee shops. That's a lot of what there is to do in Chiang Mai, and that's cool with me. I love Chiang Mai. That's not a slight to Chiang Mai at all, but certainly for me, when I'm thinking about trying to be productive and not doing as much exploring or venturing, then Chiang Mai is more practical in that regard. It's just most of what I want to do is in a reasonable amount of space, whereas in Bangkok, there's no real limit to what there is to do. The next thing I'll mention here is that Chiang Mai, in my opinion, has a bigger coffee shop scene than in Bangkok. In Bangkok, they had some coffee shops, but it wasn't kind of like as frequently in my experience as the local meetup spot. There's a number of popular shops in Chiang Mai where lots of different expats will meet up, hang out, have breakfast. In Bangkok, it felt more like the city's so big, there's so much hustle and bustle. It wasn't as frequent in my time there that I really interacted with other foreigners, which is ironic because you expect a bigger city to have more of that, but it's so spread out and there's such high population density that really that's something that if you're looking for a coffee shop scene where you're going from shop to shop and working on different things online, then in my opinion, Chiang Mai is going to have a better scene for you. And also the prices are going to be a bit lower at the coffee shops in Chiang Mai. So that's something else where if you're really doing something every single day and you want to address your daily expenses, your daily costs, then that's something to take a look at. So the next thing I'll mention here, and I mentioned it before, but Chiang Mai is easier to navigate. If you're somebody that wants to basically know the outline or the area where you're going to be spending time, then you can really, for most people, nail it down to Old City, Nimon, and the university area. I know some people will disagree and they spend time in other parts of the city, but I think a lot of fresh expats, a lot of people that are new to this lifestyle, new to visiting Chiang Mai, they'd be really well served by getting an Airbnb or a hotel in one of these areas because that's going to be the easiest area to navigate as far as for a fresh person. I'm not saying you can't go further out. I'm not saying I may not go further out at some point, but the further out you go, you have to keep in mind that you'll eventually need to rely on a motorbike, and that can be quite dangerous. So for me, personally, I'll likely end up near CMU, and that's basically a convenient option for me personally and my needs. And definitely if you end up in Chiang Mai while I'm there, don't hesitate to say hello. Of course, if you want, you could send me a message beforehand if you see me out in town and we could meet up. I'm fine with that. That's not something I have a problem with. But yeah, that's just kind of some of what I have to say as far as in relation to navigation. It's not just that you're going to be walking everywhere if you do end up pretty far out. That's something you really want to keep in mind, is that if you aim for a locals only neighborhood in Thailand, especially in Chiang Mai, it can be more difficult. That's not the case in Bangkok, and I'll give a nod to Bangkok there, where you can be on the outskirts and still manage without a motorbike. You can get a bus transportation, you can do in some cases BTS or MRT. There's a bigger variety, water taxis, things like that. The next thing I'll mention about Chiang Mai is, unlike Bangkok that has dozens of malls, realistically speaking, if you consider the city and the outskirts of the city, then you're going to have in Chiang Mai a couple of malls that have everything that you need. You have a regular mall, Maya Mall or Maya Mall, that has a movie theater, a ton of restaurants, clothing stores, dollar stores, and cell phone place to get your data, and etc. And then you have an electronics mall. I think it's Santip Plaza. Throw a name down there if you remember, or if you've been there. But that mall has a lot of your hard drives and video game stuff, and so you really go to one of those two malls, and that's a lot more convenient, I think, for a lot of people than in Bangkok, where you might be going to 3 or 4 different malls to find what you need. I know I personally have gone to multiple malls, taking several hours just to find what I needed, and that's not a fault of Bangkok. That's just how it is. It's a major city, and they have the population that dictates that being necessary. But in Chiang Mai, having a smaller population, if you don't like to spend a lot of time shopping, I think Chiang Mai is going to be easier in that regard. Now, you may have less variety, but that's just a trade-off that exists there. The next thing I'm going to mention is Doi Suthep. It's a lot of fun to visit Doi Suthep. It's a beautiful mountain right on the edge of Chiang Mai. Joe Rogan actually visited Doi Suthep a few weeks after I did. It was hilarious. I was looking on social media. I think he went in June of 2018. And it's just, what a small world, but it's that prolific that somebody that Joe Rogan, who his time is very, very in demand, he chose to bring his family there, and I believe they had a wonderful time. But that's something that you need to consider if you're really an outdoorsy person. You like spending time in the mountains. That's going to be harder to do in Bangkok. You're going to really have to, maybe you could go down to the beach, but that's not really the mountains, and even then the beaches can be quite busy. So really keep that in mind, that if you're looking for that outdoorsy feeling, that Chiang Mai does have more of a nature kind of feeling for people that are looking for that. So the next thing I'm going to mention here is that there's solid options for each type of food. You're not going to have 100 sushi restaurants in Chiang Mai, but there's several really, really good ones. I think one that I'm a big fan of, it's Tsunami. It's near CMU, near Chiang Mai University. And there's another good spot in the old city. And then there's good Italian restaurants, good pizza places, good American style restaurants, Korean fried chicken, different kinds of noodles, Japanese noodles. And so when you are in Chiang Mai, even though you might see, oh, it's just 1 million people here, it's not going to necessarily feel like you don't have all those options, that you're in a only Thai city. Now, the Thai food is absolutely delicious. I recommend, if you go to Thailand, to have a lot of different Thai food. But that's something that you need to keep in mind, that if you feel like I'm going to be giving up a lot of the things I like, well, that's not necessarily the case. And that's why I'm going with Chiang Mai, because I like having some Western food. I like having the occasional pizza, or I like having some Italian food. And these kinds of things, if I went to a much, much smaller town, might not be available. But because Chiang Mai has enough people there, enough tourism, enough expats, that kind of thing, to support some of these businesses, then certainly I can have that variety that I'm seeking after a while. For just a week, not a big deal. I could eat Thai food every meal. But if I'm going to stay somewhere for 8 months, 10 months, a year, then I definitely want to be able to have some of these different kinds of international foods that are really some of my favorites. So the next thing I'll mention here about Chiang Mai is that the street food is really, really good. Not just the pad Thai, which a lot of people think of, but there's a variety of different kinds of northern Thai dishes. I believe it's minced pork is a really popular dish in northern Thailand. And also you can get eggs, and you can get a lot of different things that are really, really tasty, sort of what are called rotis, which are similar to crepes, but a little bit different. Those are popular in Chiang Mai. So the next thing I'm going to mention here about Chiang Mai is that it's easy to make plans. So I've made friends and dated in both Chiang Mai and in Bangkok. And in Bangkok, if you're trying to make plans, sometimes it's just an all-night thing, where I've dated in some cases, or people that... So another thing that I like about Chiang Mai over Bangkok, and this is a factor that has me thinking I should lean more in the direction of Chiang Mai. Of course, I'm still undecided, but it's really easy to make plans in Chiang Mai. The difference between Chiang Mai and Bangkok is that in Bangkok, when you're talking about making plans with people, whether it's friends or somebody you're dating, they could live an hour, hour and a half away from where you live. And so similar to LA, you're talking about an all-night trip to try to get together and make plans. Somebody's going to have to spend a ton of time on a train or in traffic or on a motorbike to spend time with somebody else. In some cases, it doesn't mean you can't have friends close by, and I'm sure a lot of people, most of their good friends are within a reasonable distance of them in Bangkok. But unlike Bangkok and Chiang Mai, most of the city you can get from point A to point B in like a half hour. That's not always the case. Sometimes traffic gets just super, super backed up. But most people are living in a smaller area. There's not as many people living all over the city. Like, as an example, one of my friends, I just was talking to her, she was asking me, oh, where did you stay when you were in Bangkok? I mentioned I stayed in central Bangkok, I stayed in Bang Kapi, I stayed in near Yaowarat, Chinatown, I stayed in a few different places. None of them were near where she lived. So she lived in a way different part of the city than these neighborhoods, and it was really, really interesting, and because I probably had quite a different experience in some ways than what she would have being there. Not just the fact that she's Thai, but also that different neighborhoods have different kinds of vibes, different unique attributes, different kinds of amenities, things like that. And so that's something that you should consider when it comes to Chiang Mai versus Bangkok, is that if you're somebody that's looking to make plans with people and really hang out with people a lot and have a close group of friends, in Bangkok you may be somewhat limited by neighborhood, whereas if you are in Chiang Mai, then you can make that a bit easier, in my opinion. So I hope these tips have been helpful. I talked about a lot of different advantages of Chiang Mai, whether it be that it's more laid back, a slower pace, it's more economical, it's cheaper, it's easier to get around. There's a lot of great coffee shops. it's manageable to kind of adjust to, in my opinion, a little bit more quickly. Of course, you have Doi Su Tep, you have solid options for all kinds of different food. There's good street food. It's easy to make plans. I mentioned that. And yeah, I hope this video has been helpful. Definitely give me a thumbs up. Comment down below and let me know what you think. Have you been to Chiang Mai? Are you looking forward to going back to Chiang Mai? What are your thoughts on Chiang Mai? I'm planning on hopefully getting to Thailand this fall, but I'll definitely keep you updated on how that goes. And yeah, definitely subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and I'll see you next time.